Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Julia, for that introduction. Yes, I actually ended up using the very, very simple title, Righteous Anger, with a question mark, because I have to admit that for me, it has been a very interesting question even to pose to myself of what actually constitutes righteous anger. And in some respects, if it is even possible. And as Julia was saying, I think I'd really like to start by bringing to mind the present moment, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in a sense, exactly as a time that highlights the challenge that we will try to unpack tonight. So is anger a force that mobilizes to justice? Is it a necessary passion to mobilize to just action? And as the world is stunned to awareness over what is happening, is righteous anger what is in fact being demanded of us? Or is there another, perhaps even better response? And when the world actually responds to this crisis, potentially the worst political crisis in Europe since the Second World War, how are we to evaluate if our anger or otherwise is truly just? I guess I ask these questions hoping not so much for answers, but for us to consider the framework that I would like to propose for our conversation this evening. I admit, in his very introduction to this reflection series, Thomas, who couldn't be with us this evening, he had remarked that what strikes us about the title of the series, On Righteous Anger, is the passion itself, anger. But I admit that the comment had set me thinking, because when I accepted the offer for this concluding reflection, it was not because I was struck by anger, but rather by that qualifier, righteous, since I'll be honest, judging based on my own personal experience with feeling anger or with being angry, I'm not even sure that the two are the same. I don't think they are. I admit that I had serious doubts about whether anger as a human passion could ever be described as righteous. In fact, I think last Friday, biblical scholar, Professor Anthony Frendo, I think he stressed pretty much the same. Through his analysis of passage after passage from the scriptures, and of course, this is the biblical tradition on which Giotto's frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua are based, and more specifically, the two cycles of the life of the Virgin and the life of Christ that highlight the heart of revelation as the experience of salvation. The sense that I got from that talk was that Professor Frendo was stressing that only God's anger, assuming it can even be called such, can be called righteous. And moreover, and perhaps more paradoxically, the very mystery of salvation that the Giotto frescoes depict is about God who, even though his divine wrath is righteous, still chooses to not act on his just anger, but rather, through God's infinite mercy, to justify us instead. So through his righteous anger, God actually chooses to declare us, the sinful, righteous, and to not act on his wrath. When one stops to consider this, and Professor Frendo certainly did that last week, and as the Apostle Paul stresses, it is in fact truly scandalous. It is a scandal, if you will, against justice itself, not only to declare the guilty just, but to set them free, to not condemn the guilty at all. Every fiber of our being desires to protest, indeed feels passionately what we think perhaps is righteous anger, that the corrupt, the scum of the earth, the Hitlers, the Stalins, the Putins, you can add your own villain to the list, are declared just. But this is not even all there is to it. God does not simply justify us, the guilty, those whose hands are still red with the innocent blood of all victims, declaring us just. God actually invites us, sinful and corrupt as we are, to not only become just, but merciful and holy like God's self. So I like to start basically with a summary of what I'm thinking. And in my reflection for tonight, this is in fact the gist that I want to try to unpack with you. As Julia herself stressed in the very first reflection in this series, anger in itself has a cycle from passion to action that demands discernment. And what I would like to add tonight is that discernment cannot simply be the exercise of human virtue, but only of divine grace. Quite literally, that if human anger is ever to be called righteous, it is only because it ceases to be merely human, but becomes the fruit of the Spirit's presence within us, who angers, but never merely justly, but mercifully, truly creatively, outpouring abundant life, since himself, the Lord and giver of life, as the creed puts it, who acts through us. So I will try to structure this in 3 steps, especially considering that, I'm not quite sharing the screen myself. So first, I will try to sit with the passion of anger in itself and reflect a little bit on its movement within us. Then I will try to situate the passions, especially the passion of anger, in the traditional understanding of virtue, as in fact, Julia highlighted the frescoes themselves do. And Julia did this beautifully. And lastly, I will try to offer a bit of a theological commentary on what I think, or at least this is my hunch, righteous anger is actually all about. Since my hunch is for temperance to tame the passions, it actually needs the theological virtues. And as I will try to unpack, specifically the virtue of caritas, that as the tradition shows, is the very nature of God that we are invited to participate in, precisely through Christ's own, not mere cleansing of the temple, but becoming the temple. This is what Professor Frendo also stressed last week. Him who is the very icon of the Father, the fullest revelation of God as all merciful, as slow to anger, who gives his very life to the world. So I guess my summary for the evening, so perhaps you can stop even right now. God's response to sin death is not to condemn, but to become sin, to become death, transforming death itself, and in that regards also anger, into life everlasting. So I'll start with the first part, the passion of anger. I admit that, these past few weeks, since I've been asked to offer reflections on righteous anger, it became very, very natural to me to stop and consider my own anger first. I have spent these past weeks not just thinking about anger, but actually trying to be attuned to the very emotion within me. And I have to say that more than ever, I have realized how quick to anger I am. And as anger in itself became a more familiar passion, I also noticed how much more complex it is than I had previously thought. I don't, for instance, just feel angry. I feel frustrated. I feel mildly irritated, but sometimes my feelings escalate to mad with rage. Yes, they do. So these different states, and there is a spectrum that, of course, as we all know, is much more complex and nuanced than what I'm describing, also appear to have undertones that are not simply what I would call anger. I have, for instance, detected worry when I feel irritated. And that worry ultimately has another source, the fear, that fear of losing something, and usually something that is extremely important to me. So the more important it feels, the more I am bound to feel frazzled and to anger. I have also, and this very, very literally, shed tears of anger. When I feel enraged, it turns out, it actually has less to do with the violent urge to vengeance and more to do with extreme, overwhelming sadness that, yes, is also then transformed to this desire to almost like be violent. But there is also a sense of loss, a sense of shame, and perhaps more precisely, a feeling shamed. That is what really gives the sense of rage, or ashamed. it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between those two. So underneath the passion of anger, it seems there is a deeper instinct, something perhaps akin to what the popularization of Freud terms thanatos, a death instinct, a tendency to chaos, indeed the fear of the dragon of chaos itself, to choke the breath of life and to turn order into disorder, something into nothing, light into darkness. And perhaps most especially this idea of logos, the principle of intelligibility captured in speech and reason, into horror. And horror, I think, as quintessentially experienced by Adam after the fall. I think there is something to this. Adam, after the fall, after the famous story of eating the apple, which I don't think is the most important bit, the eating of the apple, but Adam experienced himself naked and in absolute shame at his nakedness, at his nothingness, at his inherent created nature tending to nothingness. He experienced horror at the sight of God who made him, or at least this is what I kept imagining. He experienced horror at the God that had dignified him, favored him, chosen him among all creatures to be like God in his very image. I think there is an experience of extreme horror, of extreme awe and terror at being simultaneously faced with one's immense potential and one's extreme finitude, with knowing that in one's hands, through one's decisions and actions, both personal and ours as a community, there is the responsibility to embody greatness or to hide in shame. That Adam, the first human, chose to hide in shame, that he believed that God would condemn him as he deserved, is the existential angst perhaps that we all, Adam's natural sons and daughters, those human like him, feel as we rage in madness with tears pouring forth from our eyes. For I think we know full well that death with a capital D is not just of the body, it is truly of the soul that feels sinfulness, the whole idea of mortal sin as a kind of mortality that runs deep across generations, a tendency to corruption, and perhaps this is the idea of original sin, a tendency to corruption that goes beyond my own body turning to dust, but about my bloodline being, in a sense, contaminated with chaos, with sin, with a tendency to destruction. So I guess this is, in a sense, what we term original sin, the primordial way how Adam turned his natural desire for God away from his creator, and in a sense poisoned it in shame. Desire, this whole idea of eros, through which life bubbles, becomes thanatos, death. Desire turns to angst. Creativity turns to violence. It is not surprising that perhaps, or at least once again, this is me imagining, that the son of Adam commits fratricide out of shame, his anger annihilating his brother. It is also illuminating, I think, how God treats both father and son who feel ashamed. He clothes Adam and Eve with, as the church fathers note, pathos and techne, the passions to direct action and the skill to execute creatively. And he also marks Cain, who becomes the father of a line of city dwellers. I think there is a sense where human civilization is born out of this existential angst that somehow we feel threatened by death, physical and of the soul, and that somehow we compensate for this creativity, for this fear with creativity, by trying, in a sense, to order both our environment, literally, that's the whole point of a city. It is the environment ordered according to our choice, but also human relationships. Together, this complex amalgam of environment and human relations is exactly what we call the polis, the city, the font of civilization, the polis that is the work of human hands and of ingenuity. And in many ways, it is a very, very successful way of conquering chaos, of conquering death. But at the same time, as the story of the rise and fall of empires attests, that also continuously reminds us, of how fragile, of how all too human our civilizing success is. I guess that is the whole point of what we are experiencing at this present moment. As a cynical saying puts it, war is the continuation of politics by other means. In a sense, I guess what I've been trying to say is that all nature is in a sense unfinished, and human nature is part of that, caught between order and disorder. Primitively speaking, all creatures also tend in these opposite directions, like from the simplest amoeba, but also ourselves as complex organisms. We are attracted, and ultimately we are attracted to order, we are attracted to the complexity that we call life, but we are also repulsed, and we are repulsed ultimately by chaos. So to start a bit my reflection by engaging with Thomas Aquinas, in many ways then human beings also have these passions, also have these attractions and repulsions in which we are going to situate the whole discourse on anger. But I think that human beings are also acutely aware that order and chaos are bound to events. So they don't simply happen randomly. They are bound to actual chains of events, and some of which we do have control over. That is the whole point of us being free. So in this sense, human passions also move to action. Action that is never inevitable, if it is truly human action, precisely because it implies awareness and conscious decision. So it is in this sense that the Christian tradition, as exemplified by Aquinas, has in fact also analyzed anger. So Thomas Aquinas, in fact, classifies anger, and Julia, now you can share the quote, among the irascible passions rather than the concupiscible powers. So he puts it this way. So the object of the concupiscible power is sensible, good or evil. So you simply apprehend it as such, you simply know it as such. It is what gives you pleasure, it is what gives you pain. But since the soul must of necessity, because of our falling condition, experience difficulty and struggle at times in acquiring some good or in avoiding such evil, insofar as such good or evil is more than our animal nature can easily acquire or avoid, therefore this very good or evil, in as much as it is of an arduous or difficult nature, is the object of the irascible faculty. And therefore, whatever passions regard good or evil absolutely belong to what he classifies as these powers of desire, for instance, joy, sorrow, love, hatred, and such like. Whereas those passions, so those emotions which regard good or bad as arduous, so they experience what we experience as good and as the evil to be avoided as something arduous, as difficult to obtain or to avoid. These are what he describes as belonging to the irascible faculty. And he mentions here daring, fear, hope, and the like. Interestingly, he excludes anger. But of course, he will also say eventually that, the very word irascible makes us realize that anger is included. However, in fact, in analyzing all passions, whether they conceive of the good as desirable in itself or as arduous to obtain, and likewise what is evil, Aquinas also notices something very distinct about anger. And I am going to quote at length. So, in the movements of the appetitive faculty, good has, as it were, a force of attraction, while evil is what repulses us. So it has a force of repulsion. In the first place, therefore, good causes in the appetitive power a certain inclination, an aptitude, or connaturalness in respect of good. And this is what we understand by love. So love is what we feel inclined towards. And the opposite of this love, this is how Aquinas reasons, by the way. He always tries to bring together the opposite. And the contrary of this love is hatred. Secondly, if the good if the good be not yet possessed, it also causes in the appetite a movement towards what one beloves. So what one desires. So you have this movement towards the desire to desire, in a sense. And that's the point. This is precisely the passion of desire or concupiscence. And contrary to it is aversion or dislike. And then when the good is actually obtained, you can finally rest. And that sense of rest is delight or joy. Or the contrary, if it is an experience of evil, it is this extreme sorrow or sadness. And this is the interesting part. On the other hand, in the irascible passions, the aptitude or inclination to see good or to shun evil is presupposed as arising from the concupiscible faculty with regards good or evil absolutely. And in this respect of good not yet obtained, it is what we have as hope and despair. And in respect of evil not yet present, we have fear and we have daring. But this is the interesting bit. But in respect of good obtained, there is no irascible passion because you have it. Because it is no longer considered in the light of something arduous. There it is. But evil already present, so being in the presence of evil, if you will, gives rise to the passion of anger. So he continues that accordingly it is clear that in the concupiscible faculty there are three couples of passions: love and hatred, desire and aversion, joy and sadness. And in like manner, there are three groups of the irascible faculty: hope and despair, fear and daring, but anger rests alone. It has no contrary passion. And consequently, there are altogether these 11 passions, of which, of course, anger is one. So, in this analysis, therefore, we see how the specific passion of anger arises when evil is sensed. And when an evil is brought to awareness, and this part I think it is also important to analyze. For this reason, anger may be called a general passion inasmuch as it is caused by a concurrence of several passions. So I was kind of right when I was analyzing my own experience of anger. Because the movement of anger does not arise save on account of some pain inflicted, but not just. So the pain inflicted is, of course, the experience of evil, but there is something else. And unless there be desire and hope for revenge. For, as Aristotle says, the angry man hopes to punish, since he craves for revenge as being possible. And consequently, if the person who inflicted the injury excel very much, anger does not ensue, but only sorrow. So, in other words, from the very fact, and I'm still quoting, this part I'm still quoting, from the very fact that anger is caused by contrary passions, i.e., by hope, which is of good, and by sorrow, which is of evil, the problem of anger is that in itself, it includes a sense of contrariety. It is a contradiction in itself. So I guess this brings us to our actual scope tonight, and throughout this past month of unpacking this whole idea then, this complex notion of righteous anger. For if anger is in itself both hopeful and sorrowful, both good and evil, in which particular way can it actually be termed righteous? So this is the second part of my reflection. Anger as situated in the context of the virtues. So, as I kind of noted before, Thomas Aquinas notes how the very term irascible power takes its name from ira, anger, not because every movement of that power is one of anger, but because all its movements terminate in anger. And because of all these movements, anger is also the most powerful. So he also notes that anger, in its very essence, is associated with justice. And in the sense, it makes the term righteous anger almost superfluous. In fact, he notes how anger is to be distinguished from mere hatred, precisely because vengeance, rather than the mere infliction of evil on the other, assumes a sense of justice. So here is the quote. The species and nature of a passion are taken from its object. Now, the object of anger is the same in substance as the object of hatred, since just as the hater wishes evil to him whom he hates, let's be honest, so does the angry man wish evil to him with whom he is angry. But there is a difference of aspect, for the hater wishes evil to his enemy as evil, whereas the angry man wishes evil to him with whom he is angry, not as evil, but insofar as it has an aspect of good. That is, insofar as he or she reckons it as just, since it is a means of vengeance. Wherefore, also it has been said, as we said before, that hatred, in fact, implies application of evil to evil, but anger denotes application of good to evil. And he continues, now it is evident that to seek evil under the aspect of justice is a lesser evil than simply to seek evil to someone, because to wish evil to someone under the aspect of justice may be according to the virtue of justice, if it be in conformity with the order of reason. And anger, in fact, fails, so he's clear that anger still fails, only in this, that it does not obey the precept of reason in taking vengeance. However, to my mind, that is precisely the point. Anger relies on a feeling of being personally offended, of being personally hurt. And in that sense, it can be both spontaneous, but also actively nurtured. If it is spontaneous to the extent that the offense and the hurt is real, anger can follow the order of reason, i.e., it is justifiable. Anger can be just in the technical sense of the term, justifiable. But both to the extent that anger is nurtured and that one seeks to retaliate on the basis of feeling anger, whether anger is truly righteous is another question altogether, or at least that's where I'm at. So as we all can tell from our own experience of anger, it is, I think, inevitably poisoned when one purposefully augments anger by being quickly aroused, by dwelling on it, or through obsessing over the desire for vengeance to the extent that one does not rest. In the sense, I think anger is indeed a force to be reckoned with, and it can be as dangerous to the one against whom it is directed, even assuming it is justly directed, as to the one who experiences it. Ultimately, you can quite literally be consumed by anger. So I think this is why Aquinas does not simply treat anger as a passion, as an irascible appetite, but also as a vice, indeed a capital vice, that is one from which many other vices can emerge. And this is because of these two aspects that I've just mentioned. The desire for vengeance can lead to unspeakable acts, and the very experience of anger, as we all know, very easily clouds our mind, clouds our judgment. And of course, if it is clouding your mind and it is clouding your judgment, it cannot be reasonable. And indeed, anger does not only remove obstacles to evil doing because of this big push that it gives you, but Aquinas goes on to explain how 6 clusters of sins are directly called the daughters of anger. So here they are. Anger may be considered in 3 ways. First, anger in thought. And anger in thought, from this kind of anger, 2 vices can arise. One is on the part of the person with whom a person is angry and whom he deems unworthy. You feel indignant of acting gods towards him, and this is the whole expression, this is the whole sense of indignation. And the other vice is on the part of the person himself, insofar as he devises various means of vengeance, and literally, like, your mind blows up with, it's called the swelling of the mind, as you become obsessed with this idea of vengeance. But then anger can stop being simply in your head and can emerge through your speech as expressed in words. And this can be, in the manner of speech that truly hurts. And Aquinas stresses that this clamor denotes disorderly and confused speech. But it can also break out in speech that is truly injurious, speech that is truly hurtful. And when this speech is against God, it is what we call blasphemy. And then anger can also proceed to deeds. And this anger, of course, as we all know, can give rise to quarrels, can give rise to war. And under this category, all manner of injuries that can be inflicted on one's neighbor through anger. So, of course, in this sense, it becomes the opposite of the whole idea of love of neighbor. So this implies, as the frescoes in fact show, that if there is any righteousness to anger, you might remember, if you were present 3 weeks ago for Julia's presentation, where she showed temperance and the ira, the virtue and the vice, it must be carefully tempered. So Aquinas notes that it is, in fact, the temperance of anger comes from a particular virtue, meekness. It is meekness that moderates anger according to right reason. But then, this is also really, really interesting. In quoting Aristotle, he also elaborates that unlike other virtues, you have to keep in mind that the whole idea of virtue is that it is about the mean, okay? When it comes to meekness, the habit that observes the mean in anger remains unnamed, Aristotle is saying. So the virtue that tames anger is a virtue that seeks the diminution of anger. And it seeks to make it smaller. It seeks to make it disappear, essentially. For the virtue is more akin to diminution than to excess, because it is, of course, much more natural to man to desire vengeance for injuries done to him than to be lacking in that desire. So, similar to meekness, and Aquinas discusses both virtues together, there is also clemency, but meekness is the actual virtue vis-a-vis justice, while clemency is, and therefore right reason. So the right way of dealing with anger is to seek to make it smaller, is to seek to make it, weaker. It is to seek to be meek. But when it comes to the exercise of the law, in actual legal justice, then the equivalent virtue would be clemency. And what clemency seeks to do is actually, it seeks to mitigate the punishment. That is, as it were, the person who deserves punishment is in fact not punished any further. So to me, all this seems contradictory, but perhaps this is indeed the point, that ultimately a truly righteous anger is anger that chooses, with the emphasis on chooses, to be extinguished. And its action is in fact a choosing not to act on vengeance, but rather to forgive. And I guess this is the problem, or at least this is where I get a bit stuck. Is it humanly possible to tame our anger, to forgive those who have injured us, to, as the gospel puts it, love our enemies? If it is truly gospel, good news, it seems that indeed it is truly the meek that can be called blessed and will inherit the earth. And righteous anger might in fact be more impossible than we thought. After all, being meek is a beatitude. It is not exactly one of those things that we can, it is not exactly one of those virtues that can be easily acquired. And that's the point. So we move to the third section, the third and concluding section, and I hope, and I think we will have some solid time for conversation, which is what I was hoping for. And although I'm going to try to do a little bit of a theological reflection, really and truly what I want to try and do is to situate the whole idea of anger, or at least give some small pointers of where I would try to put anger within the context of Caritas. And in a sense, to continue from where I started, and also to continue a little bit from what Professor Frendo was discussing last week. So it is in this context of the seemingly, at least humanly impossible, that I now want to situate, or try to situate, righteous anger. And in this sense, including Jesus' own expression of anger, that ultimately, as Professor Frendo stressed last week, did not harm, but what it actually did was reveal the truth about the Father. I mean, I'm not going to repeat the insights that Professor Frendo shared with us last week. I would encourage you to listen to the talk again. But I just want to explore a bit further the theology that was hinted at, and specifically to unpack the relation between what we tend to associate as being more Lutheran justification and the theology of divinization that we tend to associate more with, the Orthodox, or sanctification. In a sense, I like to see them as the two sides of, a bit of the third word that Catholics really like to use, this whole idea of redemption. We tend to understand the theology of salvation through this idea of redemption. So I will also, as I've done throughout, I will also try to rely a little bit on Aquinas, and more specifically on his teaching about the fount of all the virtues, which is love itself. So in his Summa, to situate it for you, Thomas actually organizes his understanding of the Christian life as mirroring the life of the Creator. So his understanding of the Christian life ultimately is a fulfillment precisely of what Adam failed to live. So as he famously puts it in his introduction of the Secunda Pars, so the second part, which is this large part on let's call it more theology for want of a better word, I think it's more the theology of the Christian life. He puts it this way: since, as Damascene states, so John of Damascus, man is said to be made to God's image insofar as the image implies an intelligent being endowed with free will and self-movement. He puts it like this: now that we have treated of the exemplar in the prima pars, in the first part, that he is of God, and of those things which came forth from the power of God in accordance with his will, in the second part, it remains for us to treat of his image, of the human, inasmuch as the human too is, like God, the principle of his actions, as having free will and control of his actions. So it is in this context, in this idea that the human is created in the image of God to become in God's likeness, that he treats his analysis of human action. And it is human action ultimately that can be termed just or not just, in light of its ultimate aim, God alone. But this ultimate aim, God alone, as propelled through the passions, and this is where he has his analysis of anger, good habits being the virtues or their contrary vices, but also as assisted by the law, and the idea of the law is associated with the idea of reason, but that must always be informed by grace. So that is, in a sense, the mindset, that is the flow. So that is the flow of the first part of the second. But then he explicates in much, much further detail what he means by the Christian life when he actually unpacks what the virtuous life actually looks like. So this is where he treats the virtues. But he's also adamant that for the human being under the curse of sin, true virtue is only possible if infused by God himself first. So, hence, he actually starts with the theological virtues, with faith, with hope, and with love in that order, that ultimately shape our prudence, our justice, our courage, our temperance, and therefore our reason as such, but also our passions. So in this schema, overall, the true heart and soul of Christian life is love itself. And it is thus in his analysis of the virtue of caritas that we truly see how the image, man and woman, can truly act and be, can truly imitate the exemplar, God and God's self. So indeed, in the virtue of caritas, of love, is none other than receiving love with a capital L in itself. So that's the Holy Spirit, and that's the whole idea of sanctification. But also being loved, also perhaps with a capital L, that is being elevated, and this is exactly as we will see how Thomas describes caritas, to the dignity of being God's beloved, God's friend. And thus, in the process, also taught how to love fellow neighbors, since one can then grasp the demand of love of neighbor, and similarly of love of enemy, only if one understands how one's beloved, that is God in God's self, has already loved them first. So it is also in this light then that we can understand the meaning of salvation and what it means to say that the good news is that Christ saves us, and how this salvation is not simply a static experience, but in itself a movement of the soul. And I think it is also in this light, or at least this is what I'm trying to suggest, that we must understand not only the appetites that are about desire, but also the appetites that are irascible, including anger itself. So to go back to where we started, I think that for the starting point of this reflection must in fact be the human as ashamed. That is that moment when Adam hid from God and therefore denied the hand of love extended by God, because he truly became aware of good and evil. And in his shame, Adam grasped God's infinite goodness, but also chose to turn away from it, enamored perhaps by this propensity that he somehow recognized in himself of also being attracted to evil, that is somehow of also being ensnared by the chaos of death. So as Adam chose, if you will, evil, as Adam experienced shame, so he became then entrapped in the cycles of violence and the cycles of, that we know as being the human condition. Cycles of being split within oneself, between the good that one desires to do and the evil that nonetheless we end up still doing. Adam is split within himself. Adam is divorced from other human beings, including from Eve herself. And ultimately, Adam really creates this barrier between him and God. And from then forward, we all, in a sense, become entrapped in a cycle of withdrawing from the one who loves us, and in that sense of denying love itself. And I think this is the experience of Hades, the hell of human existential angst. And yet, and this is the icon that you are now seeing on your screens, to experience Christ as Savior is precisely to meet him in hell. The icon of the resurrection, the icon of Christ as Savior par excellence, is precisely of Christ descending into Hades, and in Hades rising from the dead to pull out with himself all of us who are dead. And I think this is precisely the intuition of Paul and of his teaching of justification, that the ones dead who deserve the self-inflicted punishment of death, who indeed condemn ourselves to death through our denial of God's infinite love, are still declared just, are still righteous in God's eyes, are still essentially pulled out from hell. Thus, redemption, salvation, is none other than waking up to this truth that God's love is his justice, that mercy is what is proper to God. Thomas Aquinas puts it very, very, very simply. On itself, mercy takes precedence of other virtues, for it belongs to mercy to be bountiful to others, and what is more, to care for others in their wants, which pertains chiefly to one who stands above. Hence, mercy is accounted as being proper to God, and therein his omnipotence is declared to be chiefly manifested. And when he says this, by the way, he's quoting the collect from the 10th Sunday after Pentecost. But God is not only merciful towards us, God actually goes a step further. He does not merely tend our wounds of angst, of shame, of death. He does not simply pull us out. Thomas continues his reflection on, and this is like goes right after it in the same article. On the other hand, with regard to its subject, mercy is not the greatest virtue, unless that subject be greater than all others, surpassed by none and excelling all, since for him that has anyone above him, it is better to be united to that which is above than to supply the defect of that which is beneath. And hence, from our side as human beings, as creatures, we who have God above us, charity, caritas, is what unites us to God. And charity, caritas, love, what unites us to God, is of course greater than his mercy, whereby he supplies the defects, our defects of his neighbor. But of all the virtues, and this is for us human beings, which relate to our neighbor, mercy is the greatest, even as its act surpasses all others, since it belongs to one who is higher and better to supply the defect of another, insofar as the latter is deficient. So, what am I trying to say? Mercy, I think the experience of God's love as mercy is the experience of salvation. So is the experience of redemption. And it comes through this experience of being declared just. But God's mercy also elevates us. It does something else. And in this sense, it challenges us. And in this sense, it is also a path of growth for us, uniting us to God. And that experience of unity is what the fathers of the church insisted is divinization, is theosis, is sanctification, becoming properly like God by being filled with God's very spirit. Thomas concludes in this way, since there is a communication between man and God, a community that is built, and in as much as he communicates his happiness to us, some kind of friendship must needs be based on the same communication, and of which it is written, and he quotes 1 Corinthians, God is faithful, by whom you are called into the fellowship of his Son. So the love which is based on this communication, on the sense of building unity and communion, is caritas. And therefore caritas is essentially the friendship of men for God. A friendship for God that we cannot initiate ourselves. It is a friendship that is given to us through this experience that we slowly grow into. So the experience of unity with God, of being filled with his Spirit, is what allows, therefore, for this process. Radical conversion, transformation, and therefore the ongoing divinization of the human. So it is only from this experience of divinization that we can act most excellently towards our neighbor. And the excellence of that action, the highest virtue, at least the highest virtue for the human, through which we imitate God, be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful, is nothing other than mercy. Aquinas quotes Augustine, mercy is heartfelt sympathy for another's distress, impelling us to succor him if we can. For mercy takes its name, misericordia, from denoting a man's compassionate heart for another's unhappiness. But notice, this is important, and Thomas actually spent quite a while on this, that mercy is not mere feeling. There are 2 components necessary for mercy. And this is the point I'm trying to raise. 2 components are necessary to mercy in the same way how anger has 2 components. So the 2 components are these, that we are of one heart with another, and therefore, I am extending this to include the idea of anger, that we experience the injustice towards another as if it were inflicted towards us. So we feel anger when we feel that we have been treated unjustly. But we feel, or we can be merciful when we can empathize with the other who has been treated unjustly. And through feeling the suffering of the other, we are also compelled to action, that the other may have their suffering eased. So this is the point. In anger, I feel this emotion because I feel like I'm in the face of evil inflicted upon me. And that brings this energy in me where I want to act in vengeance. Mercy, in a sense, is similar, but it is not first and foremost, it is not about me being treated unfairly. It is based on the compassion that I feel for the other, but that also compels me to action, just as anger compels me to action. But this is going to be action that is creative. So this, I suggest, is where anger, the just feeling of being a victim of injustice that propels to vengeance, can be not only tamed, but actually properly channeled. So truly righteous anger is no longer mere ira, I think. I think it is misericordia, that love of neighbor that does not only make me feel the suffering of my neighbor as if it were my own, but truly urges me to act with that same passion of vengeance, but to assist, to heal, to build, and literally to build bridges, to seek true reconciliation. Thomas actually, he analyzes this. I mean, the whole point of mercy is that it also seeks the right action. It also seeks the right action that actually heals. It is not mere being nice to one another. it is concrete, and it concretely it concretely improves the situation. So for true loving neighbor, all neighbors, as God has loved us first, vengeance in itself becomes distasteful. For even the enemy, our enemy, my enemy, is seen as beloved, as justified by God. And this is the point. If God has loved my enemy, can I, who love God, hate him or her in turn? So I guess my concluding sentence is that righteous anger is actually is actually this this Christian experience of discerning the will of the Spirit, this Christian experience of connaturality with the Spirit that nurtures the habit, the virtue of mercy. It is embracing love of neighbor that can only be true love of neighbor, so true merciful love of neighbor, through the indwelling in God's love, in his Spirit. So that's it. Thank you.